Hey, it's Max from UNFTR for the MeidasTouch Network. I got to tell you, I'm starting to feel a little bad for Scott Bessant. I mean, this guy cannot catch a break lately. But before we dig into why, let me ask you something. Does this guy inspire great confidence in you as a citizen or an investor?
Brett, I am very excited about several aspects of the boom that I think we're about to see. We are going to see a CapEx boom. We have trillions of dollars coming into the country. Just yesterday, Tim Cook from Apple was in the Oval. He and Apple had committed 500 million in CapEx. They added another 500 billion. They added another 100 billion. So, a total of 600 billion. And, we're seeing that from all kinds of companies.
Jesus Christ. Looks like a hostage video. Like, who are you trying to convince here, buddy? Okay, so let's talk about Bessant's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad days of late. First, he revealed that Trump's grand economic plans are essentially a backdoor scheme to privatize Social Security, just taking money from working Americans' retirement security to fund tax cuts for billionaires. Then he stepped out of consideration to replace Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve, essentially admitting that he can't stomach being the face of what's coming next. And now, Bessant is rapidly running out of runway to keep the U.S. economy under control while somehow explaining how Trump's economic recklessness is all going to magically work out. And how do I know this? Look no further than the August 7th Treasury Auction, a financial train wreck that should have every one of us worried about where this administration is taking the economy. So today we're going to break down exactly what happened, why it matters, and how it connects to the broader economic disaster that Trump's policies are creating. Because what happened on August 7th wasn't just a bad day in the debt market. It was a warning shot that America's economic credibility is under serious threat. So let's talk about it. All right, so let's start with the basics. The federal government has essentially two ways to bring in money: revenue and debt. So revenue means taxes and tariffs, money flowing in from the economic activity that we're already generating, either as citizens or by taxing the goods that flow into the country. Debt means borrowing money by selling Treasury securities to investors who believe that we'll pay them back, but with interest. And just in this brief explanation, we can already begin to see where Trump's genius economic plan is falling apart. They've systematically destroyed the revenue side of this equation by making the Trump tax cuts not just permanent, but even more generous than before. We're talking about what the CBO estimates will be a $4.5 trillion reduction in tax revenues over the next decade. So to put that in perspective, this represents the largest upward transfer of wealth from the bottom and middle income earners to the top in modern American history. So while American families are struggling with inflation and stagnant wages, billionaires and megacorporations are getting permanent tax breaks that dwarf anything that we've ever seen before. And so with all of that excess capital, they can pour it into real estate, or bonds, equities, crypto, you name it, and compound their gains while you fall further and further behind on everything. So the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act cuts about $1.1 trillion in government spending over a decade, mostly from programs that help the bottom and the middle of the economic spectrum. But that's completely dwarfed by the $4.5 trillion in lost tax revenue. So it's basic math that any middle schooler could understand. When you cut your income by $4.5 trillion and your expenses by $1.1 trillion, you're creating a $3.4 trillion hole in your budget. And that's if the cost of bringing money in stays the same as it has in the past. And that's what we're going to explain today. So with the tax revenue gutted, the Trump administration is left scrambling to fund a $7 trillion federal budget through tariffs and debt. And as we'll see, neither of these strategies is working the way that they promised. All right, so let's start with tariffs. Yes, they're bringing in billions of dollars in new revenue, and Trump loves to brag about this. And so do his sycophants, like Howard Nutlick, seen here on Maria Butter Email Show, explaining how glorious the tariff revenues really are.
How much revenue have you brought in so far just from tariffs, Secretary?
So last month it averaged just over 30 billion. And as of last night, midnight, the tariffs went up. I think we're going to be heading towards 50 billion a month.
All right, let's go back to our middle school math for a second. The federal budget is $7 trillion. And so far this year, tariff revenue is around $125 billion, which is a substantial increase over the prior years, yes. And let's even take Nutlick at his word that soon it's going to be $50 billion a month or $600 billion a year, which hasn't happened and will not happen, by the way. But at the maximum fantastical peak of Nutlick's $600 billion tariff revenue scheme, that's 8% of the federal budget. And still $400 billion shy of closing the projected $1 trillion budget deficit. So in the best case scenario in real life of about half that, or $300 billion, then it's 4% of the budget and $700 billion shy of closing the gap. So that's where they switch to the growth explanation. The Trump administration also keeps insisting that tariffs will somehow make American exports more attractive and competitive. But here's the reality. We simply don't export enough to make a meaningful difference. We don't build things here like we used to. And Tim Apple, as Trump used to call him, coming to the White House to bend the knee and promise that they'll build more chip capacity, which is what the CHIPS Act under Biden was for anyone keeping score at home. That's not going to fix the gaping hole in our manufacturing base. Also, that's years away, best case scenario. Also, if inflation keeps going at this pace, no one's going to have enough money for your stupid phones. Also, can you imagine Steve Jobs acting like such a bitch?
This bond was made in the U.S., California, and this glass comes on the warning line. It's engraved for President Trump. It's a unique unit of one.
Meanwhile, our trading partners aren't just sitting idly by and taking this. They're forging alternate economic alliances and imposing retaliatory tariffs on American goods. So what tariffs actually do is they increase inflation. And guess what just happened? The recent CPI print showed inflation ticking up again. So this is a vicious cycle. Tariffs drive up prices, which means American families have less disposable income, which means less economic activity, which means less tax revenue for the government to collect. So the gap gets even wider, thereby necessitating more tariffs or more debt. You choose. And we're already seeing this play out. Most retailers, wholesalers, and manufacturers say that this is just the beginning, and they're warning that the real impact of the tariffs are going to hit home this fall once the current inventory stocks are depleted. And they're forced to pass higher costs on to consumers, assuming consumers are going to be able to buy anything by that time. So tariffs might provide short-term revenue, but they're creating long-term economic pain. Higher inflation, reduced consumer spending, and damaged trade relationships. This isn't economic policy, it's economic vandalism. So that leaves the government with one remaining option: debt. And this is where the August 7th Treasury auction becomes so absolutely critical to understand. So here's how government debt works in practice. The Treasury Department is always holding auctions. So they're always issuing debt or refinancing old debt. I mean, it's happening on an almost daily basis. But the big capital raise happens with the sale of 30-year Treasury bonds. So these are the ones that are considered the gold standard of safe haven investments, or at least they used to be. So on August 7th, 2025, the Treasury held an auction for $25 billion in 30-year bonds. And it was a disaster. The high yield on the Treasuries cleared at approximately 4.813%, which was significantly higher than pre-auction trading levels and well above market expectations. So here's the translation for all this. There's a key metric in there that is important to understand. It's called the bid to cover ratio. And that was 2.27, which is also below the 6-month average of 2.38. So for those that don't speak bond, this means that there just wasn't enough demand. Investors weren't willing to buy America's debt at the prices that we put it out there for. So the market reaction was pretty brutal. Treasury prices fell, yields jumped higher, and equities reversed earlier gains to finish lower. So Wall Street rightfully interpreted this as a clear sign that investors are pretty wary of lending money to the U.S. government over a 3-decade period. So think about what this means. When the yield on Treasury bonds goes up, it's because investors are demanding a higher premium to lend us money. It's like your credit score dropping, and then all of a sudden you have to pay a higher interest rate on everything. So essentially, confidence in the United States economic outlook is waning, and we have to pay more to convince people to buy our debt. And where that confidence is eroding is interesting. International official bidders, so that's like central banks and sovereign wealth funds from other countries, showed stable but weak participation. So foreign buying remained below recent averages in this recent Treasury auction. So these are the institutions that have traditionally been the most reliable buyers of U.S. debt, and they're pulling back. So basically, these foreign official entities are shifting their preferences toward shorter-term debt, showing less enthusiasm for the 30-year bonds. And this trend has been particularly pronounced since the spring of 2025, around Liberation Day, as concerns about America's fiscal path and rising global interest rates reduce international appetite for long-dated U.S. bonds. Now, here's why this matters for the federal budget. The CBO bases its deficit projections on Treasury rates at the time the projections are made. So when yields rise, like they did in this auction, it means that future deficits will be larger than projected because the government will spend more on interest payments. And here's the kicker. Over 80% of existing U.S. debt will mature and need refinancing within 10 years. More than 20% has to be refinanced in this fiscal year alone. So that means that higher interest rates will quickly pass through to the government interest payments. The CBO estimates that even a modest 14 basis point increase in the long-term Treasury rates, which is smaller than what we saw in this auction, would add $441 billion in interest over the next decade. So let's step back and see the bigger picture here. Nothing, and I mean nothing, is working the way the Trump administration said it would. And frankly, it was always magical thinking, because this is just trickle-down economics explained another way. But the fundamentals haven't changed. Tax cuts for the wealthy don't magically create enough economic growth to pay for themselves. They never have, and they never will. The other thing they've managed to do is effectively neutralize the normal Fed policy responses. See, the Fed cutting interest rates won't change the interest we pay on most of our outstanding long-term debt. In fact, the correlation between the federal funds rate and the broader health of the U.S. economy is breaking down. The Fed's traditional policy tools are becoming less effective in this environment. We're already seeing the effects of tariffs showing up in inflation data. And as I mentioned, retailers and manufacturers are warning that the worst is yet to come. I mean, no wonder Scott Bessant does not want this job. If unemployment figures continue to rise while the credit markets tighten, the Fed can raise or lower interest rates all they want, but it won't matter because the fundamentals of the economy will be blown apart. I mean, we could be looking at a scenario where the Fed is simultaneously dealing with inflation from tariffs and unemployment from an economic slowdown. The classic stagflation scenario that defined the economic crisis of the 1970s. Interest payments on federal debt have already risen sharply since 2020, by the way. They were below 6% of government outlays in 2020 and 13% by 2024, exceeding what we spend on defense. And this was before this latest auction disaster. So the cost of servicing this debt is projected to keep increasing over the next decade, and each upward revision in interest rate forecasts makes the budget outlook worse. Now, you might recall from one of my first Meidas videos that Stephen Myron got his job in the Trump White House by writing a research paper in 2024 that basically said we could build an entire economic policy around tariffs. And his theory was based on something called the Triffin dilemma. So the Triffin dilemma holds that the U.S. has to run trade deficits to supply the world with dollars, which leads to an overvalued U.S. currency and uncompetitive domestic manufacturing. So in Myron's model, tariffs help fix those trade imbalances, and they leverage the U.S.'s reserve currency status by charging trading partners for the privilege of access to U.S. markets and dollar liquidity. Here's the problem. Myron's tariff theory was built on the assumption that currency depreciation abroad would neutralize tariff impacts. And that was a reasonable assumption under the gold standard, but it's completely invalid in the era of floating exchange rates and global capital mobility. In other words, Trump surrounded himself with yes men who all agreed to support one kid's theory that is based on a purely theoretical phenomenon that disappeared in 1971 when we left the gold standard. I mean, mainstream economists have strongly criticized Myron's proposals from the start for fundamentally misunderstanding modern monetary dynamics. And the August 7th Treasury auction proves them right. So what we're seeing is that basically every economic plan under the Trump administration operates under what I call the trust me theory. Trust me. Tax cuts will pay for themselves. Trust me. Tariffs will solve our trade problems. Trust me. Everything will work out just fine. Trust me. Everyone else is wrong and I'm right. Only the most loyal members of the MAGA base still believe this. But even they will soon come to understand that the emperor has no clothes here. When the red state budgets are blown to smithereens, millions of Americans are laid off, inflation grips goods and services across the economy, and the Federal Reserve is powerless to stop it all. Because what we witnessed on August 7th wasn't just a bad Treasury auction. This was the opening act of what's officially becoming the stagflation crisis portion of the Trump recession. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can find me on YouTube and Blue Sky at UNFTR. And don't forget to sign up for our free weekly newsletter at unftr.com. And I'll see you in the next video.
Can't get enough Meidas? Check out the Meidas Plus Substack for ad-free articles, reports, podcasts, daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, and more. Sign up for free now at MeidasPlus.com.